something that I wish more Bible-believing Christians would consider is something that was said by Dr. Edward Hills, a very educated, very intelligent defender of the King James Bible and the Textus Receptus. He was a Harvard and Yale graduate. I believe Yale was the other college. He has degrees from 2 Ivy League schools. And he was also a staunch defender of the received text and the King James Bible. He referred to the KJV as an independent variety of the Textus Receptus. Now that's very interesting, and I wish more folks would think about this, because that's an intriguing way of describing the King James Bible. Let's get into it. So let's start out by talking about it like this. There are currently over 3,000 languages and dialects in the world today that still don't have the Word of God translated. Okay? That's a big need, right? And so we thank God for those missionaries that are out there, organizations that are out there doing all they can to provide the words of God into these 3,000 languages around the world today that still don't have a copy of the Holy Scriptures. Thank God for these groups, right? So, thank God for them, because I couldn't think of a more important work than providing God's words for people that never had them before around the world. But due to the demand for God's words to be translated into foreign languages around the world, very heated discussions have developed as to the right kind of resources for such sacred work. Some oppose the idea of using the King James Version as any kind of source to incorporate in the work of foreign Bible translation. Much less do they think that the King James Bible should be used as a standard to follow. But I want to explain to you why I strongly disagree with that. I do believe the King James should be the standard to follow, and I will explain. Few people amongst independent Baptists, I'm an independent fundamental Baptist, and in our circles, there are not many people that have done more for the cause of foreign Bible translation work than a man named Dr. Rex Cobb. Dr. Rex Cobb is a former missionary to Mexico, former church planting, soul winning missionary for many years in Mexico, who also happens to be an experienced Bible translator. He translated the New Testament into the dialect of the Oaxaca Indians in Oaxaca, Mexico. And he is the director today of the Baptist Bible Translators Institute, or at least he's been the director of that for many years. But this is a school that specializes in advanced linguistics for the cause of foreign Bible translation work. Now, I said all that to give you his credentials, because I now want to turn your attention to something that he wrote in an article entitled English or Greek. There's the link on it if you'd like to read the whole article in its entirety. But let me quote from his article that he wrote entitled English or Greek. He said, quote, "For the one who weighs in on the side of the Greek, let me remind you of the tremendous amount of Greek scholarship present in our authorized version. We probably have no Greek scholars today who could hold a candle to those of 1611. We believe they accurately translated the Greek into English. Also, when would a young missionary know Greek well enough to translate from it alone? He will never know Greek as well as he knows English. And besides, no one translates exclusively from the Greek. All English-speaking translators follow some English Bible even as they translate the Greek. This being the case, their translation is based upon both languages." Now, do you understand what Dr. Cobb is saying there? He goes on to say, with his concluding statement of his article, so do we translate from the English or the Greek? Yes, and from the Portuguese too. In other words, Dr. Rex Cobb is explaining that when you If God were to call you to translate the Word of God into another language, such a sacred task, in regard to the question about should that translation be based upon the King James Bible or the original languages only, he says it should be based upon both, including the Portuguese Bible. And he kind of threw that in as a humorous remark to make the point that, here's the point, the Bible translator should avail himself of all resources. But especially, here's the point I want to add to this. Not only do I agree with Dr. Cobb that they should make use of all resources available, but I believe that they should place special emphasis in the use of the King James Bible. Dr. Cobb argues not only for the use of the KJV as a prominent source, but also the incorporation of many reliable, trustworthy sources, because guess what? That's exactly what the King James translators did. Man, they used several editions of the Textus Receptus by Erasmus, Beza, and Stephanus. They also used the Complutensian Polyglot. They used Collinnaeus, I believe. They also used other foreign translations. Martin Luther's German translation was available to them. The Reina Valera in Spanish was available to them. The French Olivetan was available to them in other languages. They used a whole lot of Latin manuscripts, not just Jerome's Latin Vulgate, but the Latin Bibles of the Waldenses and Old Latin. Erasmus had his own Latin translation. They had a lot of Latin manuscripts and texts to work with. They used all kinds of resources from all kinds of languages. All right. And so the Bible translator today should do the same thing, right? But I want to take this a step further. Not only do I believe the King James should play a special role in the work of foreign Bible translation, but I believe it should serve more than just another resource. I believe it ought to be the standard to follow to ensure textual purity. And the reason why I believe that is because I personally believe the King James Bible is perfect. And so if the King James Bible is perfect and there are no errors in it, as far as I'm concerned, I don't believe there are any errors in the King James from Genesis to Revelation. Well, if that's so, and I believe it with all my heart, where are you going to find a better standard to follow than one that is perfect? Okay? And here's the thing. Even for those that would contest what I just said, here's what you cannot contest. Here's what is not up for debate. You can't even argue this against this, that you're not going to find a better collection of experts and linguists and qualified scholars that worked together. You're not going to find a better group of top linguists and scholars than the group of the 54 King James translators that worked together for 7 years between 1604 to 1611. You're not going to find a better group than them when it comes to the making of a Bible in any language. So the point I'm trying to make here is this. When you use their work to collate, to compare as a standard to follow, to ensure accuracy and purity, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. You're incorporating the best collection of scholarship of all time. That's the whole point of this video. Now, there are people that go nuts when you insist that the King James Bible should be the standard to follow for foreign translation work. For example, I'm very embroiled in the Spanish Bible controversy, another passion of mine. And those that defend the corrupted 1960 version of the Reina Valera Bible, which has many changes in it based upon the critical text, people that defend the 1960 go crazy when we insist that the King James Bible should be incorporated in the revision of a Spanish Bible or any other language. But what they fail to realize is this. There was an argument one time with a pastor in Venezuela who was trying to argue that the Bible translation, whether it's Spanish or any other language, no foreign language Bible should be based upon the King James. They should all only be based upon Hebrew and Greek. That all Bibles in any language, in every language, should only be based upon the original language text. Hebrew for the Old Testament, Greek for the New Testament. Guess what? Little did that individual realize, and it was pointed out to him, that if that's the case, there's not a Bible on the entire planet that you can use, because there's not a Bible that ever existed or that exists today that was only based upon the original languages. All Bible translators availed themselves of multiple resources, as many resources as they could possibly accumulate, not just in Hebrew and Greek. The King James translators used manuscript evidence from all kinds of languages. You know what that's called? That's called diligence and thoroughness to ensure purity and accuracy. Okay? And as a matter of fact, the 1960 Reina Valera defenders don't even realize their hypocrisy when they go nuts over us insisting that the King James Bible could be used to help purify their Spanish Bible, which is what we did with the Reina Valera Gomez Spanish Bible. We compared it with the King James and the Textus Receptus and the Masoretic text to make a Bible that is 100% based upon the received text and in agreement in purity with the King James Bible. But those that would complain against that, complain about that, they don't understand the hypocrisy in their complaints, because the Bible they defend in Spanish, the 1960 Reina Valera Bible, is also based upon English Bibles. For example, here's a quote by Dr. Jose Flores, who was involved in the revision committee of the 1960 Reina Valera, and he admits right here in this quote, read it for yourself, press pause and read it. There's the evidence from the book he wrote, El Texto del Nuevo Testamento, page 323. He admits that they departed from the Textus Receptus to follow a better text. There's the quote right there. What does he mean by a better text? He's talking about the critical text. They believed that the critical text was a better text than the Textus Receptus. We disagree with him. And then he goes on to reveal that in the 1960 Reina Valera, they used the English Revised Version of 1885. That's the English Bible put out by Westcott and Hort. And he also reveals that they used the American Standard Version of 1901. That's the American version of the Bible put out by Westcott and Hort. And they admitted that they also used the Revised Standard Version of 1946. That's a modernist version of the Bible put out by Westcott and Hort. And they also use the International Critical Commentary. So, and there's a photocopy of the evidence right there. It's irrefutable. It's undeniable. They used other Bibles. So if they can use other Bibles, why can't we use the King James Bible? If they can use corrupt critical text Bibles, why can't we use our pure Textus Receptus based Bible? That's a hypocritical argument. It's a double standard. Okay. So even though the foundational basis for any Bible translation ought to be the received text, yes, that is so. But I believe the KJV ought to play a much greater role than just that of a secondary source. It should be, and the reason why is because the KJV is more than just another accurate or faithful Protestant Bible. Although accurate and faithful it is, I believe the King James Bible is the very Word of God in English. Perfect and inerrant. Flawless. That's what I believe about the King James Bible. And the reason why the King James Bible should have a very prominent role in regard to other Bible translations in other languages when trying to ensure a pure text is because the King James Version is the crowning work of the received text. Let me repeat what I just said. The King James Bible is the crowning work of the received text. So a valid question that has been raised by those on both sides of the fence is, which edition of the Textus Receptus should we use? If we're going to make a Bible in another language based upon the Textus Receptus, which edition should we use? Because there are many editions of the Textus Receptus. You have the Textus Receptus editions put out by Beza, the ones put out by Stephanus, the ones put out by Erasmus, the one put out by Collinnaeus. There's the one by Stunica. There's the ones by the Elzever brothers. There's many editions of the Textus Receptus. And then when you choose which author of the Textus Receptus you're going to go with, then you got to choose which edition of those authors. For example, Beza did 10 different editions of his Greek New Testament, the Textus Receptus. Which one of those 10 editions are you going to use? Well, that's why you want to go with the King James Bible as the standard to follow, because the use of the King James Bible eliminates all that confusion. It answers the question, because the King James Bible, the King James translators incorporated the best of all editions of the Textus Receptus. What you have in the King James Bible is an independent variety of the Textus Receptus, because it incorporated the best of all the editions of the TR. That's what Dr. Edward Hills explains in his book, which I encourage you to get, The King James Version Defender by Dr. Edward Hills. In that book, he says, quote, "The texts of the several editions of the Textus Receptus were God-guided. They were set up under the leading of God's special providence. Hence, the difference between them were kept down to a minimum. But what do we do in these few places in which the several editions of the Textus Receptus disagree with one another? Which text do we follow? The answer to this question is easy. We are guided by the common faith. Hence, we favor that form of the Textus Receptus upon which, more than any other, God, working providentially, has placed his stamp of his approval, namely the King James Version, or more precisely, the Greek text underlying the King James Version." This text was published in 1881 by Cambridge University under the editorship of Dr. Frederick Scrivener back in 1949, being the latest reprint of Scrivener's TR Greek New Testament. In 1976, also another edition of this text was published in London by the Trinitarian Bible Society. Dr. Edward Hills goes on to say, "We ought to be grateful that in the providence of God, the best form of the Textus Receptus is still available to Bible-believing students." So here's the point. By incorporating the King James Version in the work of foreign Bible translation, the translator is incorporating both its Greek and Hebrew basis and the textual decisions of the King James translators. This is the best form of the received text to use for translation work. I mean, think about it. It's important to note, I've mentioned this already, let's mention it again. It's important to note that the KJV translators collated all the Greek texts. They also compared all the prior TR-based English translations, the Geneva, the Bishops, the Tyndales, Miles Coverdale, all of them. They also incorporated the Complutensian, Antwerp Polyglots, Latin Bibles, all kinds of Bibles, different languages. I mentioned that earlier. They had all these different Bibles at their disposal. The point is that the underlying basis of the King James Bible was not really a singular text at all, but rather a culmination of many texts within the traditional text family that represent the overwhelming majority of manuscript evidence. Therefore, the KJV should be regarded as more than just another good and reliable translation. It should be regarded the way Dr. Edward Hill puts it when he said the KJV is an independent variety of the Textus Receptus. And Dr. Hills goes on to explain the differences between the different editions of the Textus Receptus that the King James translators had at their disposal. how many differences between Beza and Stephanus's Greek New Testaments, how many differences between the Stephanus and Beza edition, and between Erasmus's Greek New Testament and the Latin Vulgate, and he gives you the amount of the differences. But the point is that when you use the King James Bible, you're using a combination of all these different editions of the Textus Receptus, plus the other resources outside of Greek and Hebrew that they use. It's all conglomerated into one source, the King James Bible. That's why I call this the crowning work of the received text, and that's why Dr. Hills called it an independent variety of the Textus Receptus. There's the quote right there from his book. Hence, the King James Version ought to be regarded not merely as a translation of the Textus Receptus, but also as an independent variety of the Textus Receptus. And, you got to think, all those different editions of the Textus Receptus, why were there so many editions? Because what is the purpose of having another edition? I'm a book writer. If I put out another edition of the book I wrote, why would I do that? Obviously, because there are some things that needed to be tweaked or modified or maybe added or subtracted. That's called revision. That's called purification. The Textus Receptus went through a development. It went through a purification process. So the point is, what Erasmus started, the King James translators finished. They purified all the editions and culminated that purification into English in one text that we call the King James Version. And so I think we've made the point about the King James Bible being the crowning work of the TR. Brethren, how can you go wrong if you're a foreign Bible translator? Whether trying to revise the Spanish Bible or any other Bible in any other language, how can you go wrong standing on the shoulders of these giants that produced the King James translation, the King James Version of the Bible? That was hands down the greatest collection of top-notch scholarship of all times. Why would you not incorporate the best scholarship of all time when it comes to the work of foreign Bible revision and Bible translation? One more time, with the King James Bible, you're dealing with an independent variety of the Textus Receptus. God bless you.